Imagine a scene set in the year of 1867. You are a young, brilliantly educated, and outrageously wealthy Belgian named George Nagelmakers. You are only 23 years old. You wear a perfectly tailored tailcoat, smell of expensive cologne, and, like the hero of a romantic novel, your heart is broken. Yes, the story of the Eastern Express did not begin with an engineering blueprint, but with a simple love drama. George's parents, respected bankers, were vehemently opposed to his relationship with his cousin. It was a classic problem of European aristocracy in those days. To cool the passion of young Romeo, they did what all wealthy parents did in the 19th century. They bought him a ticket on a ship to New York. "Go, son, see the world, have fun, forget her," they said. Little did they know that instead of forgetting his cousin, their son would bring back from America an idea that would revolutionize travel and force their bank to spend quite a fortune. So, George was in America, a land of opportunities, wild prairies, and, of course, railroads. At that time, Americans took pride in their trains, just as we now boast about the latest scientific achievements. And the leading name in this market was George Pullman. Remember that name. Pullman was the Henry Ford of the railway world, a true titan of industry. He conceived and created the mass-market concept of the sleeping car. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? A sleeping car. Instantly, visions of soft beds, silence, and comfort come to mind. Oh, how terribly our Belgian friend was mistaken. When Nagelmakers first stepped into a famous Pullman car, his cultural shock was akin to the feeling of ordering a room at a grand hotel and being put into a soldier's barracks. What was considered the height of civilization for pragmatists looked like a social experiment aimed at forced social mixing to the European aristocrat. Imagine a long carriage, basically a mobile barrack. During the day, it's just ordinary seats facing each other. But when night falls, a real show begins. The conductor, skillfully juggling mechanisms, lowers the upper beds, slides out the lower ones, and suddenly the entire carriage turns into a dormitory. No walls, no doors, only fragile curtains separating your sleeping space from the central corridor. And it was a disaster. George recorded in his diary that the experience could only be summed up as some sort of nightmare on you. Imagine lying on a narrow bunk, a thin curtain to your left hiding a Texan cattleman who hasn't seen a bath in 2 weeks. To your right, a crying baby, and all night long people walk up and down the aisle, bumping your elbows and knees. Privacy was a forgotten concept. Changing into pajamas? Forget it. You had to do it lying down, twisting like a snake under the blanket, trying not to drop your watch or bang your head against the upper bunk. Most men passengers simply took off their boots, and the smell of dozens of Parker boots in a closed carriage, frankly, was not reminiscent of lavender fields in Provence. They unbuttoned their collars and fell asleep fully dressed. To George, it was barbaric. On one such night, when the train was jolting somewhere between Chicago and New York, he probably couldn't sleep at all. Picture this dialogue. George, politely peeking from behind a curtain, addresses the conductor. "Excuse me, sir. Could you ask the gentleman on bunk number 4 to stop singing in his sleep? And perhaps there is a way to close that, structure." The conductor, lazily spitting tobacco with alarming precision into a trash can or onto the floor, responds, "Listen, buddy, this is America. Here, democracy means everyone sleeps the same way. Senator or minor, same pose." Welcome to Lectures Under the Moon. I am Daniel Hayes, and today we'll explore the fascinating history of the Eastern Express. You pay for transportation of the body, not for comfort. If you want silence, buy a horse. Americans endured this everyday nightmare for a simple reason. They were pragmatists. They needed to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible to conduct business. Comfort was for the weak. The main priorities were speed and efficiency. But George Nagelmakers saw things through the eyes of a European. He understood that his aunt, the Countess, would never travel in such a carriage in her life. An English lord would rather walk than sleep in a compartment with a stranger who is sharpening an apple with the very same knife used to cut tobacco. In Europe, trains were different. They were compartmentalized, yes, but there were no sleeping quarters as a separate class. There were first-class sitting compartments upholstered in velvet, where passengers could doze while sitting, resting their heads on lace-trimmed napkins. If the journey extended into the night, unfortunate ladies and gentlemen tried to curl up on the seat, waking up with stiff necks and terrible moods. And somewhere amid the endless American plains, to the rhythmic clatter of wheels and the symphony of snoring, George Nagelmaker's mind sparked with an idea. A simple, brilliant idea. What if he took American technology, the very concept of the night train, and radically changed its interior? What if passengers weren't just given a bunk, but a small, tiny room? An actual room on wheels, complete with a lockable door, a proper bed, and a wash basin. It was an epiphany. He realized he could sell not just train tickets, but entire hotel rooms on wheels. Georges began feverishly jotting down notes. He studied the construction of the carriages, the suspension systems, and the food service organization. He watched as passengers at American stations sprinted out of trains to gulp down some dubious soup at the station buffet, burning their tongues and elbowing their way through crowds. Georges thought. He returned to Europe in the year of 1869. His longing for love was replaced by obsession. In his suitcase, instead of souvenirs, lay blueprints and plans. He went to see his father. "Father, I know what I want to dedicate my life to." The banker, likely, even set aside his morning newspaper, gazing at his wayward son with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Excellent, Georges. Are you finally ready to lead our branch in Brussels?" "No. I will build sleeping carriages like those in America, but without the dirty boots for kings." Father's face froze in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. In Europe, the railway system was a patchwork quilt. Every country and tiny principality had its own standards, track gauge, and rules. The idea of running a single train across borders seemed madness, but Georges was stubborn. He published a book with an ambitious title, Proposal for Installing Sleeping Cars on the Continent's Railways. Notice the word proposal. At that stage, it was merely a fantasy. He needed to prove it was even possible. His early experiments were modest. He arranged to attach his experimental carriage to a train running from Paris to Vienna. And here we arrive at a crucial moment. Georges Nagelmaker's first carriage was far from the shining marvels we would later see in films. It was, essentially, a modified Prussian carriage. It was a two-axle car, which meant that at each rail joint, passengers jolted like loose screws in a tin can, cramped and noisy. But inside, there were compartments, isolated compartments. The initial passengers greeted this novelty with suspicion. Europeans in general were quite conservative. The idea of undressing on a train, lying in a horizontal position while the vehicle was moving, seemed indecent to many. Social ladies would scoff at the thought of sleeping on a train. But anyone could walk in at any moment, and if an accident happened, in what state would they find us? Wearing a nightgown? What a disgrace. Georges understood that he wasn't just selling a berth. He was selling safety and status. He had to persuade the elite that sleeping on his train was just as respectable as sleeping in their own bedrooms in mansions on the Champs-Élysées. Yet, there was also the problem of borders. Europe in the year of 1870 was a powder keg. Prussia was at war with France. Borders closed, then reopened, then shifted. To send a train across the continent meant negotiating with a dozen governments that despised each other. Nagelmakers displayed remarkable diplomacy. He was courteous to the Germans, charming with the French, respectful toward the Austrians. He used his connections, his father's money, and most importantly, persistence. He promised the transport ministers that their countries would become the key hubs of a new transportation network. Of course, he told everyone this, but the greatest obstacle lay ahead: technical imperfections. The candles dripped wax onto the jackets, the heating system ran on steam from the locomotive, and when a carriage was detached at a station, it would freeze solid instantly. In the earliest versions, the toilet's pipe led directly onto the tracks, and in winter, pardon the honesty, the opening would freeze over, creating an icy stalagmite that blocked everything. Georges refused to give up. He founded a company with a name so daunting it almost sounded intimidating: the International Company of Sleeping Cars. It sounded prestigious. All that remained was to build a train that matched its name. He hired the finest engineers. He ordered ebony from Asia. He decided the lighting should be gas, not candles, risky but bright. He wanted the bedding changed daily, which, for that time, was considered incredible extravagance. By 1883, everything was ready for the grand debut. Georges invested his fortune. He risked his family's reputation. He sat in the train earlier than scheduled, but he had created a miracle. On the 4th of October, at the Eastern Station in Paris, the locomotive released a cloud of steam, drowning out the orchestra. Passengers took their seats, clutching tickets worth a fortune. But in their eyes was not only excitement, but also a hidden anxiety. They were heading not just to Constantinople, but into complete uncertainty. Behind the windows remained civilized Europe, while ahead lay the wild Balkans, rumors of bandits, and nights when gas lamps might be the only refuge from darkness. The wheels turned for the first time. The American nightmare stayed behind across the Atlantic. But would the fragile Belgian dream withstand the harsh reality of the railroads? Imagine yourself sitting at a table covered with a pristine white cloth. Silverware clinks, crystal glasses catch the glow of gas lamps. Opposite you sits Henri Opère de Blovec, the legendary correspondent of the Times, a man with sideburns so wide they could hide a couple of smuggled canaries. He smiles, raises his glass, but you notice his hand instinctively steadying his plate when the carriage tilts on a bend. "Monsieur Nagelmakers claims we are perfectly safe," he murmurs, lowering his voice so the ladies won't hear. "But I've heard that in Bulgaria, locals dismantle the rails simply because they need the iron for horseshoes. I hope our locomotive is formidable enough to confidently resist any horse that tries to test its strength." You chuckle nervously, because you know that Monsieur Surtuck has a loaded revolver tucked into his pocket, just like most gentlemen in this dining car. It was the strangest party of the 19th century. Tuxedos, diamonds, haute cuisine, and a collective readiness for siege. But let's step outside the restaurant for a moment and look at this train of the future from the outside. If you're expecting to see those famous blue and steel cars with golden crests that you've seen in films about Hercule Poirot, I must disappoint you. They did not exist yet. The first Eastern Express looked quite different. It was made of teak wood. Teak, a noble, expensive material that, importantly, does not rot. But wood is still wood. The carriages creaked and breathed as they moved. They were a living organism, 70 meters long, groaning, cracking, and sighing at every rail joint. The train consisted of only 5 cars, 2 sleeping cars, 1 dining car, and 2 baggage vans. The baggage and provisioning cars, positioned at the front and back of the train, served as what you might call a safety buffer. Do you know why baggage cars were placed at the ends? It was a kind of cushion. If there was a collision, the first to take the hit would be the suitcase with your trousers, not yourself. A harsh but logical calculation by an engineer of that era. The technical equipment of this marvel of engineering deserves a discussion of its own. Nagelmakers was very proud of having introduced the idea of bogies. Previously, European trains were built with two axles. Imagine a cart rigidly attached to the rails. Every bump transmitted a jarring shock directly to the passenger's spine. Georges brought from America the idea of swiveling bogies, designed to soften the ride. They did provide some relief, but remember, in 1883, rails were laid not by robots with laser levels, but by exhausted workers wielding pickaxes. The rail joints were wide, so the smooth ride promised in advertisements often felt more like a bobbing motion on a small yacht in a storm. Soup in the bowls seemed to have a life of its own, creating tiny tsunamis. And the art of the waiter was to catch the moment of calm and place the glass on the table without splashing its contents on the dress of some countess. Now, lift your eyes to the ceiling. The lighting. It was Nagelmaker's pride and the chief nightmare of fire inspectors, had they existed at that time. Gas. Each carriage was equipped with cylinders of compressed gas, with pipes running to elegant chandeliers. The light was bright, warm, and cozy, much better than the dim oil lamps or flickering candles Europe was accustomed to. But imagine this. You are rushing through the night inside a wooden box coated in lacquer with containers of explosive gas beneath the floor and above your head. Any spark, any derailment, and this palace on wheels could turn into the most spectacular blaze in history. The passengers preferred not to think about it. They would rather discuss the heating. "My goodness, how warm!" the ladies exclaimed, fanning themselves with their fans. And it was true. Before Nagelmakers, train heating relied on hot water cans, flat metal containers filled with boiling water, exchanged at stations. They cooled within an hour, and for the rest of the night, travelers shivered in silence. On the Eastern Express, there were coal stoves and a steam heating system. Sometimes it worked too well, turning the compartments into saunas. Other times, it broke down. But the very fact that you could travel in winter without wearing a fur coat seemed like magic. Returning to our first journey, dinner was over. The gentlemen lit cigars in the lounge. Yes, smoking was allowed almost everywhere. Ventilation was provided by the method of, quote, 3. And then came the moment of truth. It was time to sleep. On the first journey, there were about 20 passengers, all invited, not a single random person. Georges Nagelmakers personally checked the carriages, asking, quote, _4, __. He was so nervous, as if he were taking an exam before a strict professor. And the entire European press was that professor. The sleeping quarters in those first carriages were transformed from sofas. The backrest would lift up, forming the top bunk. The lower sofa folded out into a bed. The bedding was made from the thinnest Dutch linen. But space is space. If you think modern compartments are cramped, you simply haven't seen those. Two gentlemen sharing a single compartment had to have choreographic skills to avoid bumping heads when one took off his tailcoat and the other searched for a nightcap. "Excuse me, Count, is that your leg or mine?" one passenger might ask in the dark. "I suppose it's mine, Baron, but after the 5th glass of Bordeaux, I'm no longer sure about anything." And so the train races through the night. Munich, Vienna. In major cities, they were greeted by orchestras. Crowds stood on the platforms, eager to touch the magic train. Sometimes Nagelmakers ordered the train to stop right in the middle of the night at some remote station, just so the cooks could buy fresh milk and eggs from local farmers for breakfast. Imagine the shock of an Austrian dairymaid when, suddenly, a gleaming train appeared before her, lights blazing, and a man in a blazer on the platform politely asked her to sell a bucket of cream. But the further east they went, the more anxious the passengers became inside the carriages. After Budapest, they believed civilization ended. The Balkans began. At that time, it was a region of political chaos, recently freed from Ottoman rule, full of highwaymen, insurgents, and simply reckless people. Rumors, told from one passenger to another, sent chills down the spine. It was said that about a month earlier, local bandits had stopped a mail train, dismantled the tracks, and robbed everyone thoroughly, taking even their underwear. That detail terrified the aristocrats the most. Losing a wallet was vexing but survivable. But the prospect of standing in the middle of the Balkan steppe, exposed and vulnerable in the face of unwashed bandits, this was a social catastrophe from which no salon in Paris could save you. So, when the train entered Romania, the atmosphere changed. Ladies stopped wearing their family jewelry to dinner, hiding it deeper in their luggage. Men began deliberately cleaning their weapons. Nagelmakers, trying to lighten the mood, joked, "Gentlemen, if we are attacked, I will personally offer the gang leader a yearly pass for first-class travel. I'm sure he won't resist our menu." The joke drew only faint smiles. The most interesting part began in the city of Giurgiu, at the border with Bulgaria. There, the tracks ended. Yes, the Great Eastern Express, connecting the West and the East, could not physically reach Istanbul, then still called Constantinople. The bridge over the Danube had not yet been built. Passengers had to disembark. Imagine that scene. Night, a cold wind coming from the Danube. Ladies in silk scarves huddle in the carriage. At that moment, the magic of the hotel on wheels cracked apart. You are no longer a celestial being gliding through space with a glass in your hand. You are a freezing passenger being transferred from a boat to the train in the piercing wind, like a precious but slightly damaged cargo. On the other side of the station, they awaited a different train, markedly less luxurious, belonging to the Austrian railways because the tracks for the carriage led by Lee did not yet reach that far. But Nagelmakers had anticipated everything. Even on this unfamiliar and ordinary train, he managed to carve out a small sanctuary of comfort. He brought his chefs along, with his wine and bedding. "We can't change the Bulgarian rails," he would say, "but we can change how you feel when traveling over them." Varna was the final destination of the railway line. Beyond that, the journey continued by sea. The last stretch to Constantinople was made aboard a steamer. When they finally saw the minarets of the Mosque of Hagia Sophia piercing through the morning fog over the Bosporus, they felt like heroes from an epic tale. They had traveled across all of Europe, and they had survived. The bandits never appeared, much to the mild disappointment of journalists craving a sensational headline. They slept in beds while the world rushed by outside. The entire journey took about 80 hours, nearly 4 days. Today, a plane covers the same distance in just 3 hours. But does an airplane serve turbocharged meals with sauce at 10,000 meters altitude with the same elegance? The first flight was a triumph. Newspapers were bursting with excitement. Nagelmakers proved that sleeping on wheels is possible, eating on wheels can be delicious, and crossing borders can be safe. Yet behind this glittering exterior lay the colossal effort of the crew and engineers. To make a passenger in a compartment feel as if they were in paradise, dozens of people had to work tirelessly, almost as if in a very hot forge. We discussed the first journey, the fears, and the menu, but one crucial detail remained unmentioned. Without it, the story would be incomplete. We often talk about compartments, luxury, comfort. But how exactly was it all arranged? How did engineering ingenuity manage to pack the unpatchable, a sink, a wardrobe, and a bed within a space no larger than a closet? In the next chapter, we'll take a magnifying glass and examine the anatomy of that legendary compartment. We'll analyze every screw, every inlay panel, and learn why the sink was a secret and why the ladder to the top bunk was a test of sobriety. Get ready. We're about to peek into the most intimate corners of the Eastern Express. So, you're inside now. The lock clicks, sealing out the noise of the corridor. You were left alone with silence, the aroma of red wood, and a space that at first glance seems to mock common sense. Welcome to the Holy of Holies of the Eastern Express, the sleeping compartment, or as it was called in promotional brochures, the boudoir on wheels. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? But let's set aside the romance and take out our tape measure. The standard size of a two-person compartment from the classical era was about 2 meters in length and 1.5 meters in width. Yes, you heard right, 4.5 square meters, less than a bathroom in a modern Khrushchevka apartment. And in this tiny space, engineers had to fit 2 beds, a wardrobe, a small table, a wash basin, luggage storage, a ladder, a heating system, and ideally the passengers themselves, all without driving them into a panic attack from claustrophobia. It was not just an engineering challenge, it was a Tetris puzzle for geniuses. If IKEA had existed at the end of the 19th century, its designers would have wept with envy looking at the drawings of the cars from the Intercontinental Wagon Company. Because every inch here was maximized. There were no mere walls. Each wall doubled as a door. Each door was a small table, hiding some secret underneath. Let's take a closer look. During the day, the compartment looks like a cozy lounge. The seats were wide and plush, initially upholstered in velour or fabric featuring geometric patterns in later versions of the Art Deco cars. The walls were not made of plastic or wallpaper. They were polished wood, mahogany, teak, or Cuban mahogany. Inlay work was a craft unto itself. The famous LX series cars, modestly named for luxury, showcased panels decorated with works by Renlich. These weren't merely wooden surfaces. They were canvases crafted from different veneer species, flowers, nymphs, grapevines. You could travel for a week and find a new curling motif on the wall each day, never noticing the same pattern twice. But the most fascinating details revealed themselves when you decided, say, to wash your hands before dinner. You looked around, only to find no sink in sight. Instead, there was an elegant wooden cabinet tucked into the corner. Opening its lacquered doors, like a small altar, you discovered, to your amazement, a basin, and not just a plain tin bowl, but one made of porcelain, or even marble. Above it hung a mirror, with shelves for crystal bottles and towel racks. This was the legendary invisible sink. When closed, it transformed into a writing desk or a stand for glasses. But as soon as you lifted the lid, a clever system of levers was triggered. Water. It was the main currency on the train. Each compartment did not have an endless supply of running water. Instead, a tank was hidden in a niche above the ceiling. Water flowed by gravity. If you turned the tap and nothing came out, it meant your supply was used up, and you had to wait until the next station, where stern men in oil-stained overalls would climb onto the roof with hoses. Speaking of sounds, the basin had a peculiar feature. In early models, the drain lacked a complex siphon. Water simply drained in the direction of the wall, so when the train gained speed, a characteristic whistling wind could be heard from the drain, sometimes accompanied by odors reminiscent of the steam locomotive working beneath the floor, consuming tons of coal. To muffle the sound of the road, passengers used plugs, but an unfastened plug would rattle from the vibrations, driving sensitive souls mad. Imagine a conversation in a compartment somewhere near Vienna. "Darling, could you stop tapping your fan? I'm trying to concentrate on the stock reports." "It's not me, Antoine. It's the soap dish. It's been knocking for the 3rd hour. Seems like it's trying to send us a Morse message." Now, let's talk about luggage. That was a sensitive issue. Ladies of that era did not travel with backpacks. They traveled with wardrobes. A morning dress, a tea dress, a dinner dress, nightwear, hat boxes, sewing cases, leather suitcases about the size of a small chest. Where could all this fit in a room measuring just over 1.5 meters by 1 meter? Part of the luggage was stored in the baggage car, the one at the tail of the train. But the most valuable items, the jewelry, documents, and enough change of underwear for 3 days, were kept close. For that purpose, monumental grid-like shelves were built into the ceiling. These shelves were so sturdy they could support the weight of an adult person, though testing was not recommended. Arranging suitcases on these shelves resembled building a card house during an earthquake. If a suitcase was poorly secured, on a sharp turn through the Carpathians, it could slide down, making the phrase, "heavy awakening," literal. But let's return to the design. Lighting, for example. In the earliest versions, gas lamps were used. But in the 1920s, electricity arrived, and everything changed. The lamps became part of the decor, with frosted, tulip-shaped shades and a soft yellow glow that could make any woman appear beautiful, and any man seem like a mysterious spy. There was even a special blue bulb, a nightlight. It emitted a ghostly, barely perceptible light, so that when you woke up suddenly in the night from a sharp jolt, you could understand whether you were in your compartment or in a dark, gothic underground chamber. In some other dimension. Now the floor beneath your feet was covered by a thick woolen carpet that absorbed footstep sounds. Beneath the carpet was a layer of cork for soundproofing, and under that, the wooden floor of the carriage. Nagel Macers was obsessed with fighting noise. He understood that the clatter of wheels was only romantic during the first 20 minutes. By the third day, it was torture. Therefore, the floor was constructed in multiple layers, like a Napoleon cake. Still, physics could not be fully defeated. The Eastern Express compartment had its own soundscape. The creak of wooden panels rubbing against each other as the carriage moved, the ringing of a spoon in a glass, the muffled thuds of buffers during braking. All these sounds told seasoned travelers about their speed and even about the character of the terrain. "We're slowing down," said an experienced diplomat without looking up from his newspaper. "Hear how the tone has changed? We're crossing a bridge." "Or has the engineer just decided to have some coffee?" his skeptical neighbor replied. But the greatest wonder of this space was its transformation. The compartment was a shapeshifter. During the day, it was a study. You sit on the sofa, write letters on the fold-down table, watch the passing Alps through the window. But evening falls, and he appears, an attendant, a man in blue uniform, the keeper of keys and secrets. He asks you to step into the corridor for just a minute, and behind the closed door, magic begins. We will discuss this ritual in detail in the next chapter, but for now, it's important to understand the mechanics. The back of the sofa rises on hinges and turns into the upper bunk. The sofa itself becomes the lower bed. From somewhere in the wall's depths, a small, velvet-upholstered ladder appears, an object of endless jokes. Climbing it while sober was easy. After a dinner of 5 courses with wine, as the carriage rocked on the switches, it was a circus act. Many gentlemen preferred to sleep downstairs, not out of status, but from pure instinct for self-preservation. Falling from the upper bunk of the Eastern Express was considered less painful than humiliating. And there was one more detail, rarely mentioned in novels: ventilation. Of course, there were no air conditioners. There was a window. It could be opened, but there was a problem: the locomotive. If you opened the window to let in fresh alpine air, you also let in coal dust. The morning after, a passenger sleeping with the window open risked waking up looking like a coal miner after a shift. That's why complex systems of ventilation grills were devised above the windows and doors. They were supposed to allow air to pass through while trapping soot. Their effectiveness varied. The smell of the Eastern Express was not only Chanel perfume and coffee, it was always, without fail, a faint, elusive hint of coal smoke, the scent of travel. The walls of the compartment were thin. Despite all the luxury, soundproofing between neighboring compartments left much to be desired. If your neighbor snored, you snored along with them. If behind the wall some passengers were settling old scores, or, conversely, making peace too loudly, you became an involuntary listener to this auditory drama. This created a special atmosphere of forced intimacy. You might not have known the name of the person behind the wall, but you were aware that he coughed every morning and sang arias and baritone pieces when he shaved. In this tiny space, measuring just 4 square meters, people led small lives. Here, secret alliances were forged, espionage reports written, and hearts broken. Engineering ingenuity created the perfect setting, but how exactly did the transformation from a guest lounge into a bedroom take place in this wooden carriage? How did ladies in corsets and gentlemen in braces prepare for sleep when the floor seemed to shift beneath their feet? It was no longer a matter of mechanics. It was a matter of ritual. And about this sacred act, about nightshirts, caps, and the struggle against gravity, we will talk further. Imagine that you have just returned from the dining car. You are full, slightly intoxicated from Burgundy and the swaying of the carriage, and your only desire is to stretch out your legs. Yet your compartment still looks like a sitting room. Where is the promised bed? Now the scene shifts to the master magician of this train. No, not the engineer, not even the chef. It's the steward, or as they called him, the sleeper car conductor. These were people of a special breed. The Lee carriage hired this role primarily from retired military officers, former butlers from bankrupt estates, or the sons of fallen aristocrats. They were required to possess 3 qualities: absolute honesty, fluency in at least 3 languages, and the ability to become invisible. You press the call button. In just a second, literally a second, they are sleeping in the corridor on a folding stool, quietly guarding your peace. A person appears at the door, dressed in impeccable blue uniform with gold buttons. "Monsieur wishes for the bed to be prepared?" he asks in a tone of voice usually reserved for questioning the destiny of the universe. You nod and step into the corridor, because observing the compartment's transformation was considered bad form. Plus, physically, you would just get in the way. As you stand at the window, watching the lights of European villages pass by, a miracle of logistics unfolds behind the closed door of your compartment. The steward works with the speed of a Formula One pit stop. With one movement, he lowers the backrest of the sofa, transforming it into a pristine white sheet. With another, he pulls out feather pillows from a hidden niche, naturally feather-filled. A third move spreads out a blanket embroidered with the Wagenschlitz monogram. Speaking of that monogram, the Wagenschlitz logo, 2 lions holding a shield, was embroidered everywhere, on the sheets, pillowcases, and towels. This was not just for decoration, but also for fighting theft. It turned out that even wealthy passengers couldn't resist the temptation to steal souvenirs. Later, the company even began selling these items officially, so gentlemen would stop hiding pillowcases inside their top hats. 5 minutes later, the door opens. The steward bows. "Your bed is ready, monsieur. Would you like anything else? A bottle of mineral water? A foot warmer?" You step inside and no longer recognize the room. The cozy office has vanished. Now it's a bedroom. Now the entire space is occupied by the bed. And here, the most interesting part begins: the process of changing clothes. In movies, this looks elegant. The hero simply takes off his jacket, loosens his tie, and falls onto the pillow. In reality, late 19th century attire made this a different story, an acrobatic scene titled "How to Remove a Corset in Turbulence." Consider the fashion of the time. Men did not wear t-shirts and jeans. They wore shirts, waistcoats, trousers held up by braces, a vest, a tailcoat, a tie, starched detachable collars, and high boots laced or buttoned up. As for women, women's dressing was even more complicated. Turrets, petticoats, and corsets made from whalebone. Dozens of hooks and stockings held up by garters. Undressing required closing curtains and doors, balancing on a tiny patch of free floor no bigger than a handkerchief. The train swayed, and you tried to slip off a boot while standing on one leg. The carriage lurched sharply at the switch, and suddenly you were flying toward the wash basin, trying not to smash your forehead into the mirror. "Damn it!" came a voice from the neighboring wall. Who built these roads? I nearly swallowed my collar stud. Experienced travelers knew the secret. You had to undress sitting or lying down. But removing tight trousers while lying was a task requiring the flexibility of a yogi. So, in the compartment, it was often possible to hear muffled body thuds and the squeaking of wooden panels, accompanied by curses in several different languages. And now, it's time for sleepwear. No boxer shorts. Gentlemen slept in long nightshirts that reached their knees or even their ankles. Why? Because it was hygienic and warm. Remember, the heating was steam-powered, but the windows let drafts in, and insulation was, to put it mildly, inadequate. Now we come to the main accessory of the night, the nightcap. Today it seems like a ridiculous item worn by fairy-tale dwarfs, but in a train of 1990, it was an essential piece. The head froze from the drafts blowing through the ventilation ducts. The cap protected the ears from the cold breeze and, importantly, shielded the hair from coal dust, which still seeped inside no matter how tightly the window was closed. Imagine this scene. A serious banker, who during the day made decisions that affected the fate of empires, now sits on the edge of his bunk in a long white shirt and a cap with a tassel, trying to carefully place his pocket watch into a special pocket net sewn into the wall. The watch, by the way, had its own designated spot. It couldn't be left on the table, as the vibrations might cause it to slide onto the floor and break. So, a special velvet-lined pocket was hung near the head of the bed, designed specifically for the watch. The same pocket also held glasses and false teeth. Yes, many aristocrats suffered from dental problems. And, of course, there was a small steel safety pin for added reassurance, especially if the passenger was particularly cautious. Nighttime security was a separate matter entirely. The compartment door was locked with a latch, but that wasn't enough. Inside, there was a steel chain or bolt that couldn't be opened from the outside, not even with a conductor's key. Passengers feared not only train wrecks, but also hotel thieves. Tales of theft circulated, some true, some exaggerated. There were clever pickpockets skilled at slipping through a tiny wire into the compartment while the passenger was asleep, quietly lifting wallets and valuables. That's why many travelers kept their valuables hidden under their pillows. Sleeping on a bundle of banknotes or a jewelry box containing family diamonds was harsh, but peaceful. You lay in the darkness, the blue glow of the reading lamp barely dispelling the gloom. You begin to listen. The train sounds different at night than during the day. In daylight, the clatter of wheels is drowned out by conversations, the ringing of dishes and lively chatter. But at night, the train is alone with the vast emptiness. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. The rhythmic sound is soothing, but suddenly, a sharp whistle from the locomotive, a piercing alarm in the night that makes you jump in bed. It's the engineer signaling before entering a tunnel or approaching a station. Then, silence. The train halts. Where are we? Vienna? Budapest? Or just a semaphore in the middle of a field? You lift the curtain. Darkness. Only the occasional lanterns of track workers sway like fireflies in the gloom. Somewhere far off, a dog barks. You hear the hissing of steam from the locomotive, as if a tired beast is catching its breath. In these moments, loneliness feels especially intense. You are enclosed in a tiny wooden capsule, lost somewhere in the vast expanse of Europe. But now, let's return to the physiology of sleep. The bed in the Eastern Express was narrow, roughly 28 inches wide. Turning over onto your side was possible, but stretching out like a star was out of the question. There was another problem, too: inertia. When the train suddenly braked, it did so with a violent jolt. The Westinghouse vacuum brakes gripped the wheels so tightly that passengers would slide forward or backward, depending on how they had lain down. Experienced travelers always slept with their heads pointing in the direction of travel. Why? Because in a sudden stop, it was better to brace your legs against the back of the bed, where they could spring and absorb the shock, rather than risk smashing your head against the wooden panel. This was an unspoken rule for survival on the rails. But what if you were on the upper bunk? Ah, that was the domain of the young and daring. Up there, the rocking was felt more intensely. The amplitude of the cars swaying at a height of about 2 meters was noticeably greater. You would sway like in a cradle, rocked by a mad nursemaid. To prevent injury, there were safety straps. Yes, you literally strapped yourself to the bed so that at night you wouldn't accidentally fall onto the lower bunk. A neighbor below might ask, hearing a suspicious groan. Came the reply from above. Still, despite the tight quarters, the jolts, and the coal dust, there was something magical about that sleep. The bedding was changed every single day. Every day. At that time, even in good hotels, linen was typically changed only once every 3 days, and at home, only once a week. But Nagelmaker insisted on crisp, fresh sheets. How did they do it? The supply of clean linen occupied half of the baggage car. Used sheets were shipped to large hub stations in Paris, Vienna, and Constantinople, where the company owned its own laundries, and fresh bundles were loaded in. It was a logistical operation of military scale, all just to ensure your pillowcase smelled of lavender, rather than that of a passing passenger. By morning, sleep became fragmented. Through the haze, you'd hear Stuart walking down the corridor. He was polishing shoes. Yes, that was another ritual. In the evening, you left your dusty boots outside your door, in the corridor, just like in a hotel. In the morning, they would be shining. Stuart would collect them, take them to his corner at the end of the carriage, and polish them to a mirror finish while Europe slept. But then dawn arrived. The sun peeked through a crack in the curtains. The train no longer rushed, but gently glided past a picturesque lake or a vineyard. And now, it was time to get up. Here arose the main challenge of the morning aboard the train. You needed to use the toilet, and not just to go, but to wash your face, shave, and tidy yourself so you could face breakfast as a gentleman, not a disheveled vagrant. But remember, your compartment had only a wash basin, and there was only one toilet at the end of the car. And in this carriage, 14 other people were traveling, all with the same plans for the morning. The great morning migration began. Men in robes with towels draped over their shoulders, servants clutching trays, peeked out from compartments, assessing the length of the queue and planning their strategic dash for the coveted door. But what happened behind that door? How one could shave with a dangerous razor, and how to keep the floor from becoming a treacherous, unsteady stage. Those stories we will save for the next chapter. Because hygiene in the 19th century was not just about brushing teeth. It was a feat. Good morning, or, as the French say, bonjour. You stand in the narrow corridor of the carriage, clutching a crocodile leather bag to your chest. A silk robe drapes over you, shadows darken beneath your eyes. Thanks to the rail joints, the train still jolts ahead, and ahead of you, the line is forming. Oh, the morning line, waiting to use the only toilet in the first-class carriage. It was the most democratic club in Europe. Here, Russians, British diplomats, and Turkish carpet traders met, shifting from foot to foot in velvet slippers. Titles and ranks dissolved before the reality of physiology. Everyone was equal behind the closed door labeled WC, where the sound of water splashing and annoyed murmurs could be heard. Let's talk about what happened behind that door. The toilet on the Orient Express was considered the pinnacle of technological progress. The floor was laid with beautiful mosaic tiles, the walls were made of mahogany, and the porcelain fixtures were hand-painted. It looked like a throne room for tiny royalty, but the operation of this throne was shockingly simple and, frankly, quite frightening. You pressed a pedal, the flap opened, and you saw the rails. Yes, no composting toilets, no vacuum systems like in airplanes. Everything went, so to speak, back to nature, directly onto the track. This created two problems. The first was wind. If the train was running at full speed, about 60 or 70 kilometers per hour, opening the flap created a reverse suction effect. A flow of icy air mixed with dust, snow, and coal dust rushed into the room from below. Visiting the toilet in winter became an expedition to the North Pole. Ladies complained that this fresh breeze was harmful to health, while gentlemen simply tried to do their business as quickly as possible. The second problem was stopping. There was a strict rule, written in golden letters on a sign inside. Using the toilet during the train's stop at stations was strictly forbidden. Why? Just imagine leaving a souvenir right on the platform of Vienna or Paris, under the feet of the waiting crowd, an act considered the height of indecency. Conductors kept watch over this. Before each major station, they locked the toilets with a key, and woe to the passenger who had an upset stomach right at the moment the train was greeted by the orchestra. All he could do was pray and endure, gazing out the window at smiling people who had no idea about his internal drama. But let's return to washing up. You step inside, lock the door, and the train sways. Your task? Shave. In the 19th century, men did not wear 3-day beards. That was a sign of a roustabout or a revolutionary. A gentleman had to be clean-shaven. The safety razor by Gillette had already been invented, but true aristocrats still preferred the dangerous razor, a long, sharp blade like a scalpel. Imagine this scene. You lather your face with foam, adopt a wide stance, bracing your feet against the walls like a sailor. During a storm, you bring the blade to your cheek, and suddenly the train hits a switch. A jolt. Your hand jerks. If you were using a modern machine, you'd just cut yourself. But with a dangerous razor, let's say, the tiny pieces of metal, the special stones that stop the trembling hand's consequences, were kept in passengers' first aid kits in large quantities. Going to breakfast with a newspaper stuck to your chin was almost normal on the Orient Express. It was a kind of order of marriage, the order of morning shaving. Many, by the way, gave up and went to the station barbers. During long stops, sometimes lasting 40 minutes, local barbers made a month's income servicing frightened Europeans who were too afraid to touch a razor in a moving carriage. And now, the greatest question of our time. Where was the shower on the Orient Express? The answer is simple. Nowhere. In the traditional sense, there was no concept of personal hygiene within the soul, neither in first class nor in the luxury compartments. The idea of washing the body daily under a stream of water was still foreign to European culture of that time. It was believed that frequent washing washed away the skin's protective layer, making a person vulnerable to illness. Yet, how, did they not smell, considering the journey lasted 4 days? Oh, That was a true art form, one we have lost today. It was called cat grooming. In every compartment, as you recall, there was a wash basin. A passenger would fill it with warm water, if any remained in the tank, then take a special mitten made of terry cloth or a sponge, lather it up, and carefully wipe down the most important areas. Underarms, neck, and so forth. Afterwards, everything was generously polished with cologne. The scent inside the Orient Express carriage was a unique olfactory cocktail. Mix the smell of coal smoke. Everywhere it soaked into the upholstery. Add the aroma of expensive tobacco, smoked in all compartments. Then there was the smell of human bodies, the scent of lavender water rubbed on all surfaces, and the heavy aroma of perfumes. Women used very strong fragrances: musk, amber, patchouli. These were not the light, modern scents, designed to be unobtrusive. No, this was heavy artillery meant to overpower any competing odors. If a lady passed by, her scent trail would linger in the air for another 10 minutes, forming an invisible border around her territory. Speaking of women, their morning toilette was a feat worthy of Hercules. They didn't just wash their faces, they had to create a facade, style their hair. The elaborate coiffures of that era required hairpins, extensions, and heated curling irons. How could you heat curling irons on the train? There were no electrical outlets in the compartments during the 19th century. Instead, they used alcohol lamps. Imagine a wooden carriage, the constant jostling, and a lady lighting an open flame to curl her hair. Conductors watched anxiously, smelling burnt hair or alcohol. "Madam, I implore you, be careful," Stewart would whisper as he passed by. "We're carrying dynamite in the form of your enthusiasm for beauty." Corsets. Tightening a corset alone in a cramped space was impossible. Usually, maids would help if a lady traveled with a maidservant or her husband. For many men, this was the only physical effort they exerted all day. They would press their knee against their wife's back and pull the laces, trying not to fall over during braking. Hair. Heads weren't washed on the train. That was taboo. Drying long hair without a hairdryer, which didn't exist in the drafty carriage, meant risking a cold or lung inflammation. So they used dry shampoo, powder sprinkled at the roots, and then long combing to remove it. By the end of the journey, hairstyles grew more complex and taller, simply to hide the fact that hair was no longer fresh. As for teeth, the water in the tanks was for technical use only. Drinking it was forbidden, and rinsing the mouth was not recommended either, unless you wanted to spend the rest of the trip in that very tight space with the tiled floor. That's why a decanter of mineral water, Evian or Vittel, was always on the wash basin table. Cleaning teeth with mineral water, admit it, was a special kind of luxury only available to Orient Express passengers. And after passing through all these circles of hygiene, fighting with razors, corsets, and tiled floors, our hero or heroine was finally ready. He or she was scented, shaved, perhaps with a small bandage for a cut, dressed in a fresh shirt. They open the compartment door and step into the corridor. Facing them is another hero from the neighboring compartment. They exchange knowing looks. These are the looks of people who have just won a battle against entropy and everyday chaos. Good morning, Count. Please like this video and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon for more fascinating stories. The weather in Serbia is simply magnificent, don't you agree? Ah, yes. And it seems the wind today in the washroom blows from the south. Very warm indeed. Now, as we are fresh, clean, and as fragrant as possible, our bodies begin to recall another basic need: hunger. The scent of perfumes fades away, replaced by another aroma cutting through cigarette smoke from the end of the carriage. A scent with a capital A. It's the smell of freshly brewed coffee, toasted bread, and bacon. The stomach issues a demanding growl, which in the quiet of the corridor sounds like a lion's roar. It's time to head to the dining car, to that very place which was the heart of the train, its exchange, its theatre, and its confessional. The place where the chef performed culinary miracles in a kitchen no larger than a wardrobe, and the waiters balanced with the skill of tightrope walkers. But before we sit at a table and unfold a starchy napkin, we need to understand how this gastronomic machine actually worked, where the fresh oysters in the Alps came from, how they stored meat without refrigerators, and why the head chef was considered the second most important person after God and the train's conductor. Prepare your taste buds, because the next chapter will be very flavorful. As you step inside, the world shifts. If the sleeping compartment was your personal fortress, and the corridor a place of chance encounters, then the dining car is a stage. A grand, shimmering stage, lit by bright lights, where each passenger had to play their part, even if all they wanted was an omelette. Here, the scent isn't of coal or lavender. It's the smell of fine leather, starched linen, truffles, and bechamel sauce. The walls are finished in polished red wood, and the ceiling is decorated with frescoes depicting ancient nymphs, which undoubtedly stimulated the appetites of the gentlemen. Silverware and crystal with intricate engravings adorn the tables. But before we sit down, let's peek into a place forbidden to most passengers. At the very heart of this gastronomic temple, the kitchen. If the dining hall was paradise, then the kitchen was, let's say, a very hot branch of the culinary steam room. Imagine a room measuring about 2 by 4 meters. In its center stands a massive coal stove, affectionately called the piano by the chefs. It's blazing hot. Around it, in this tiny space, they dance, because walking there is impossible. The head chef and his 3 assistants work tirelessly. Ventilation is through a single window, but opening it risks extinguishing the fire or having a delicate sauce covered in soot from the locomotive's pipe. So the window is often kept shut. During meal preparation, the temperature inside could reach 50 degrees Celsius. The chefs work in damp towels tied around their necks, drinking water by the liters and losing weight at a disastrous rate with each trip. Yet, despite these unbearable conditions, masterpieces emerged from here. The menu of the Eastern Express was comparable to the finest restaurants in Paris, and this is no exaggeration. Georges Nagelmacher understood that to make wealthy passengers endure the jostling and soot, they needed to be fed in such a way that they would forget everything else in the world. The meal consisted of 7 to 10 courses. It all began with soup, consommé or coquille stoves. Then came fish, turbot, salmon or trout, followed by sorbet to refresh the palate. Yes, ice cream on a train without electric refrigerators. Next was the main meat course, roast échelonné, pheasant or filet mignon. Then vegetables, like asparagus with hollandaise sauce. Afterward, a poultry roast, salad, cheeses and dessert, fruits, coffee, and brandy. You might wonder how they stored all these ingredients. It was a brilliant logistical feat. The train was, in essence, a moving market. At the start of the journey in Paris, enormous blocks of ice were loaded into specially insulated compartments beneath the carriage floor. These were the refrigeration units of the 19th century. There, stored oysters from Ostend and fresh meat. But as the ice melted, the menu was carefully prepared according to the geography of the journey. While traveling through France and Germany, they served whatever had been loaded in Paris. In Munich, fresh beer and sausages were brought aboard. In Vienna, they loaded freshly baked bread and pastries. In Budapest, game and local wine found their way onto the train. Somewhere in Romania, the chef could lean out of the window and buy fresh goose or a basket of eggs from a peasant at the station. Legend has it that one day, the head chef discovered he had run out of fresh fish for the main course. The train was running along the Danube. He ordered the train to stop. Yes, the chef had the authority to do so in emergencies. He bought a recently caught sturgeon from fishermen, and an hour later the passengers were enjoying fish that had still been swimming in the river that morning. But let's return to the dining carriage. Service there was a performance. The waiters on the Eastern Express were considered the elite. They needed to possess the grace of ballet dancers and the steadiness of sailors. Imagine carrying a silver tray with a tureen of boiling broth as the train takes a turn at 60 kilometers an hour. The floor slips from under your feet. What do? An experienced waiter doesn't fight the laws of physics. He strikes a graceful accord with them. He leans along with the train, turning his legs into living gyroscopes. Not a single drop should fall onto the tablecloth. Spilled soup was considered a disgrace, one that could only be wiped away by dismissal. There was even a special trick. When the train suddenly braked, all the waiters would step back or forward simultaneously, as if they were synchronized swimmers, saving the contents of their glasses. The passengers watched with admiration, sometimes even placing bets. Will Jean manage to carry the sauce boat to table number 4, or will it fly into the décolleté of the Baroness? Jean usually succeeded. But food was only half the story. The other half was the social game. The dining car was the only place where all passengers saw each other. In a compartment, you could hide away, but here, that was impossible. The dress code was strict. Appearing at dinner without a tuxedo was as if stepping out in your nightgown and a cap. Ladies wore their finest evening dresses and jewelry. It was a parade of vanity. "Look at that gentleman at the third table," whispered a lady to her companion, hiding behind her fan. "He's eating fish with a meat fork. What a mouton!" "Probably from North America." "Or," her companion replied, "that's a Russian prince who doesn't care about the rules because he can buy this entire train." Seating was a minefield. Tables were set for 2 or 4. If you traveled alone, you were almost always assigned to someone. And that's where the lottery began. You might end up with a talkative merchant who would spend the whole dinner discussing cotton prices, or a silent Turk who would stare at you with a heavy gaze. Or, if luck was on your side, a charming widow heading to Constantinople, either for inheritance or for adventure. Conversations at the tables were a strange mix of French diplomatic language and the train's own slang, German and English. The topics were safe: weather, the scenery outside, the quality of the wine. Politics was discussed in whispers. Money never changes hands. Yet beneath the surface of these social exchanges, passions simmered. The dining car was the perfect place for espionage. Here, you could overhear a conversation between 2 diplomats just by pretending to poke at a quail with your fork. Notes were passed in napkins. Romance blossomed here, lasting exactly until the final station. Picture a small scene. A waiter pouring wine into 2 gentlemen's glasses. "Thank you, dear sir," says a man with a mustache resembling a heraldic crest. "Tell me, are we on schedule? I must be in Belgrade exactly at noon." "We are ahead of timetable, sir," responds the waiter smoothly, clearing an empty plate. "But I dare say Belgrade is quite unsettled at the moment. Rumors speak of an impending revolution." The gentleman exchanges a quick glance with his companion. "In that case, please bring us another bottle of Chateau Margaux. Tomorrow promises to be a long day." Occasionally there were mishaps. Dishes would sometimes break. Soup was especially hazardous. Despite the staff's skill, physics could not be fooled. So plates were never filled to the rim, and special ridges were placed on tables to prevent bottles from sliding onto the floor. But the greatest challenge for balance and social skills was the coffee. Drinking hot coffee from a tiny porcelain cup while the carriage rocked so fiercely that your teeth chattered, was an art form. You had to find the train's rhythm. Sip, pause, jolt, sip. Novices often burned themselves or left brown stains on their pristine white shirts, provoking sympathetic yet secretly smug looks from the train's regulars. After dinner, the women usually withdrew to their compartments, while the gentlemen remained in the dining car, which turned into a smoking lounge. Smoke billowed like a swinging cradle. They played cards, bridge, whist, poker. The stakes were high. It was said that one night a Romanian nobleman lost an entire estate with vineyards in the Eastern Express,
all without even managing to hide a smile.
It was here, amid this fog of tobacco, amid the clink of glasses and the clatter of wheels, that the darkest deals were struck. Arms dealers negotiated with government agents. Smugglers sought new routes. But who were these people really? Their faces, illuminated by the soft glow of lamps, told stories. Here's an old man with a monocle. He's just a wealthy collector, or perhaps an agent of Austrian intelligence. And that woman in the veil, who didn't eat a single bite all evening, only nervously twisting a ring on her finger. Who is she fleeing from? The Eastern Express was a Noah's Ark for all sorts of beings, from crowned heads to international con artists. If only the walls of this train could speak, they would tell tales that would make even Hollywood screenwriters turn pale. In the next chapter, we will tear off the masks. We will discover who exactly was hiding behind newspapers in those plush armchairs. We'll talk about kings who themselves drove the locomotive and nearly destroyed the entire train. About spies stealing secret maps right under the enemy's nose. About fateful women whose luggage consisted of hats and state secrets. Finish your brandy, gentlemen. The evening is no longer dull. So, we are fed, washed as best we can, and lying in our narrow beds, listening to the clatter of wheels. But sleep eludes us, not only because the pillow vibrates in time with the rails. You wonder, who is that strange gentleman with the monocle, who was scrutinizing your fork so intently at dinner? Or that lady in the veil, whose scent of patchouli seeped through the smell of roast duck? Welcome aboard the Eastern Express, the only train in the world where the passenger list reads like a police report, intertwined with the social gossip of a salon chronicle. If you peeked into the passenger register of any route between the years of 1883 and 1914, your jaw would drop. It was a true Noah's Ark for the elite and adventurers. Let's start with the kings. Today, monarchs travel by private jet. In the 19th century, they traveled on the Eastern Express. The passengers behaved as if the train were their personal toy railway, just scaled up in size. The main star and headache of the entire crew was Ferdinand I, the King of Bulgaria. This monarch had two passions. He loved luxury and was obsessed with machinery. Whenever the train entered Bulgarian territory, Ferdinand believed it was his sacred right to personally operate the locomotive. Imagine the horror of the train conductor. At some abandoned station, the king enters the carriage with his retinue. But instead of heading to his royal salon to sip champagne,
He makes his way toward the locomotive.
he removes his uniform adorned with medals, puts on a greasy machinist's apron, and climbs into the cab. 19. The real engineer tries to protest nervously, and he drove as he pleased. Ferdinand adored speed. He would accelerate the heavy train so fiercely that, in the dining car, soup spilled not only onto the tablecloth, but also splattered against the walls. Passengers grew pale, clutching handrails, praying to every known deity. Meanwhile, the king, covered in soot and with eyes shining with excitement, would yank the whistle lever, frightening sheep on the slopes.
Rumors circulated that he would break so suddenly that diplomats in their compartments were thrown out of their beds. But there was no one to complain to. You couldn't just walk up and say, "Hey, engineer!"
What are you doing?
When the engineer was the ruler of the country through which you traveled. Another colorful character was King Leopold II of Belgium. He was, let's say, a great connoisseur of female beauty. The Eastern Express was the perfect place for his romantic escapades. He often traveled incognito, but his profile with a long white beard was so recognizable that this disguise only drew smiles from conductors and generous tips for silence. But if kings were merely eccentric, the next category of passengers was truly dangerous. Spies. Agatha Christie was not inventing anything. The Eastern Express was genuinely called the Spy Express. Why? Because airplanes did not exist yet. How could secret documents be transferred from London to Constantinople or from Vienna to Paris? Only by train. It was the golden age of espionage. No cyber attacks or server hacks. Everything was done manually, with finesse, risk,
And style. One of the most vivid examples was Robert Baden-Powell. Yes, the very same who later founded the Scout movement. Before teaching children to tie knots, he was a British intelligence officer. He traveled through the Balkans disguised as an eccentric English gentleman, passionate about entomology and butterfly collecting. Everyone saw him as an innocent eccentric, running with a net across fields during train stops. But his sketchbook of butterflies was anything but simple. The patterns on the wings of his drawn insects were actually coded plans of enemy fortifications. The line across a butterfly's wing represented the outline of a fortress wall, and the dots indicated cannon positions. Customs officers leafed through his album, saw pretty pictures, and let the crazy professor pass with a smile. In London, those butterflies turned into military maps. And what about Mata Hari? The famous dancer and spy was also a frequent guest on this train. Her tactics were the opposite. She was so conspicuous and striking that no one could believe that this woman, drinking champagne amid admirers, was secretly memorizing every word spoken by a drunken general at the neighboring table. In the cramped space of the dining car, chatter became the greatest threat to national security. Imagine a conversation between two officers, confident that the noise of the wheels drowns out their voices. They are discussing plans to transfer the Third Corps across the border on Thursday, while behind them sits a modest priest reading a prayer book. Only a keen observer would notice that the priest has not turned a single page in the past 40 minutes. Yet the unluckiest people on the train were not the spies. They actually enjoyed the game. The royal couriers, however, were special messengers responsible for transporting diplomatic mail. Their lives aboard the train were a true nightmare. According to protocol, a courier was not allowed to let go of the diplomatic briefcase. Quite often, the case was strapped to the wrist with a steel chain and handcuffs. Imagine that routine. Trying to spread butter on a croissant with one hand while the other is working as an anchor. Or putting on trousers without releasing a secret from your grip. It was a pantomime worthy of a circus, but without applause. These people didn't sleep for days at a time. They dozed in fragments, resting their heads on the coveted briefcase. Any knock on the door made them startle and check the locks. If a fellow traveler tried to start a conversation about the weather, they responded with monosyllables, looking at him as if he were a potential enemy of the state. Speaking of neighbors, the train's policies didn't allow for segregation by nationality. Money has no scent and no citizenship. So, you could very well find a Turkish pasha sharing a compartment with a Serbian nationalist, or a French officer with a German industrialist. Gillmakers had created a unique zone of neutrality. While you are on the train, you are not enemies. You are passengers. Yet tension lingered in the air. Sometimes it was almost comic. For instance, Balkan aristocrats traveling with an arsenal of weapons. They didn't trust the locks on their compartment doors. Before sleeping, they barricaded the door with suitcases and hid daggers under their pillows. Stuart, walking in the morning with coffee, risked a nervous tic upon seeing the gleaming blued steel peeking out from under the blankets. Stuart would say calmly, noticing that the safety catch was off. "And I might add, you've got a live one there." There were also smugglers. Oh, the Eastern Express was the greatest conduit for smuggling in history. They transported everything: gold, diamonds, caviar, rare spices. Ladies sewed precious stones into their corsets, while gentlemen hid gold coins in the hollow heels of their shoes, which explained their strange, heavy gait. But the most popular item of smuggling was newspaper information. At a time when censorship in Europe was ruthless, a newspaper printed in Paris could be banned in Vienna, and a book published in London might be burned at the border with Turkey. The passengers of the Eastern Express were the main carriers of news. A fresh copy of the Times or gossip from Constantinople was worth its weight in gold. It was passed from hand to hand, read until tattered. The train was not just a means of transport. It was the 19th century internet, an underground cable of tiger wood laid across the continent. Naturally, there were con artists and swindlers among the passengers. They boarded in Paris, appearing as respectable bankers, with the goal of finding a wealthy, bored heir. They would invite him to play a game of bridge or poker, pass the time, and then leave Vienna with his fortune in their pockets. These con artists were masters of psychology. They knew that in the confined space of a train, people bonded faster, trusted more quickly, and let their guard down even sooner. "What a shame, my lord," quote 22. "You're just unlucky with the cards today. Perhaps you'll have better luck tomorrow. I happen to have a free evening before Budapest. Monsieur, I believe that nymph on the wall is looking at my cocktail with disapproval." "Oh, no, madam. She's just jealous. She's made of cold glass, while you're full of life. And you have access to the taste of this daiquiri. Look, dear, how picturesque the snow lying on the roof of that barn is." "Yes, darling, but why is my breath coming out in steam?" We saw their eyes in the darkness, yellow sparks jumping along the embankment. They knew we were here, and trapped. "It's impossible." They said, "The borders are closed." They warned him about the broken gauge width. But he took those challenges and made it happen. He stitched Europe together with steel threads, even as politicians tried to tear it apart. He created a space where a Turkish pasha and a British lord could sit at the same table and pass salt to each other. Think of the cooks who scrambled in tiny kitchens, the conductors who melted snow to give passengers water, the engineers who invented invisible sinks. It is a hymn to craftsmanship, a hymn to attention to detail, a hymn to what we call service, but what is truly care. Today, when we board a faceless high-speed train or squeeze into a cramped seat on a budget airline where even water isn't free, we subconsciously long for a time when travelers were guests, not just a flow of passengers. Our documentary is nearing its end. We have traveled with you through 1.5 centuries. We shivered in the early wooden carriages, feared the reckless men on the Balkan routes, danced the Charleston during the Jazz Age, and mourned over plastic cups in the 70s. The train stands on the platform. The steam locomotive, or the modern electric engine disguised as an old one, gives a farewell whistle. Through the window of the carriage, our time is reflected, restless, fast, digital. But behind that glass, inside the blue carriage, time has stopped. There, a soft glow from a lampshade made of pink silk still burns. On the table, a half-drunk glass of brandy waits. And there, they still await us. Maybe someday,
All of us will buy that ticket. The ticket to the past, where the grass was greener, the trains slower, and dreams were stronger beneath the rhythm of wheels. For now, we simply watch it go. The blue carriage with golden letters reads Company and International. It disappears into the fog, carrying with it an era when travel was an art. Thank you for being with us on this journey.
Sleep peacefully, and may your dreams be filled with the sound of wheels, not the ringing of an alarm on your smartphone. Until we meet again in the past, thank you for watching Lectures Under the Moon. I'm Daniel Hayes, and I hope you enjoyed this journey into railway history.